Hello everyone, this is Amir from Audio Science Review. I've gotten a lot of requests to do more headphone testing and more reviews of them in video. I've done them in text on Audio Science Review. So I thought I'd go ahead and show you a review, but more importantly show you my procedure and process for doing reviews, how to interpret measurements, understand concepts like equalization. And the specific headphone I thought I do a demonstration of is this Hifiman HE-6. It's a discontinued headphone, but for its time was one of those premier headphones that came out on this thing. But before I can get into telling you about headphone measurements, I need to explain what my measurement system is. Unlike speaker testing, where the concept of frequency measurements and objective analysis is still somewhat obscure and unknown by many people. In the headphone world, the community, oddly enough, has understood or learned or heard a lot more about headphone measurements, and specifically work that Dr. Sean Olive has done at Harman to try to quantify what objective measurements lead to good subjective experience with a headphone. But the research is kind of tricky. About 2 years ago, year and a half ago, when I decided to either get into headphone testing or speaker testing, I knew about the research in speaker testing, and the barrier there was really just the cost of the equipment and dealing with logistics of testing large speakers. But with headphones, the research is a lot more complicated to understand, and it relates to how we measure them. For speakers, I have a system that generates anechoic response of a speaker, and it's extremely repeatable and reliable system. Not so with headphones. So let's start with how headphone measurements are performed. You don't just stick a microphone at a headphone, right? Where would you stick it? There are different headphones, different sizes and shapes. People have come with different schemes. You can take a cheap microphone, stick it in a flat plate, and put the headphone against it, and you get one set of measurements. Or you can go to professional companies that make this kind of measurement instruments. B&K, one of them, and Grass is the other one. Head Acoustics is the third one. And buy the various measurement gear. There's a challenge in doing that, though. The research that Sean Olive did correlated measurements with the specific fixtures that he used. If you go use a different fixture, then you're really on your own in deciding what that frequency response means. And as I'll explain in a second, it is not a notion of having a flat response. Flat response does not exist, that concept in headphone testing. I'll show you in a second. But this is the fixture that I have, is the Grass 45CA from the Danish company, I think Grass is, in Denmark. They've now joined forces with Audio Precision, so same company, sister company to them. But essentially, this thing is also called a hammer, by the way. I can't show it to you because it weighs 30, 40 pounds sitting next to me over here. It's a very, very heavy fixture. It's not a plastic or anything. It's feels like there's tons of lead in there, which is great to stabilize the fixture and not let it be subject to vibrations and resonances from the headphone. But the business end of it is this. This artificial ear, or pinna, it actually sits on the outside. The microphone, the measuring mic, is actually deep inside this thing. And the first generation of these ears were actually quite stiff. And that caused a problem for on-ear headphones that sat on your ear. They wouldn't be able to flex them just like the way your real ears flex. And as a result, a lot of bass would escape. Harman discovered this and built their own artificial ear out of silicone. And Grass then later on went ahead and built their version, which is what I own. It's very supple, very soft. It feels like your ear, maybe a little bit less cartilage in it than my real ear has. But essentially, it's soft and it flexes. So if you put the headphone on and it's not 100% right, it still can make a good fit. Whereas if you had something rigid, like Mini DSP has this ears one, has the stiff ears, if you don't get the cup all the way around, the cup stands proud from the stiffness of the artificial ear. So what Harman did prior to what Harman's work was that people had two ways of calibrating these, the manufacturers of these things. They would stick this fixture either in an anechoic chamber and play one tune at it, one note at it, or a frequency sweep and see what it measures, or they put them in a highly reflective room, having reflections come from everywhere and give you that. And people assumed that, so that would be the neutral curve in a headphone, therefore you should replicate that when you're measuring headphones, and anything deviating from that is wrong. Harman's research found that neither one of those correlated well with listener preference, and that a better method was to actually go in a reference standardized listening room, put in a very highly rated speaker. When I say highly rated, I mean it did extremely well in listening tests and objectively also, and then record that output and that frequency response with a dummy head that sort of is a hat. It's called a HATS, a head and torso simulator, and then translate those measurements to this exact fixture that I'm using. Although they are using their own pinna, their own ear, which is a little bit different than this. So some minor inaccuracy exists, but otherwise, this is the fixture that they use. And using this, then they studied and figured out what the correlation should be between controlled listening tests with headphones and then frequency response measurements with this. Now, it's still a very tricky business in that you can't do proper control tests with headphones. If I put this on my ear, blind, somebody puts it on my head versus this AKG headphone, they're going to feel very different, and I can instantly cue, figure out which one you're putting on my head and say, oh, that must be that headphone. So you can't randomize those selections. So Harman resorted to a simulation of that, in that they used the same headphone all the time for testing, but they measured each headphone on a fixture like this, and then EQ'd that one target headphone to be the sound of these things. That's kind of fuzzy science there, and you just have to allow some amount of uncertainty there, because one instance that I've looked at, what they say they measured on a frequency response of a headphone, I can't even get anything close to what they say they've measured. And part of the problem is that when you put these headphones on these fixtures, you can't always get the same seal. And therefore frequency response changes. And so one solution people will come up quickly, which is we do 5 or 6 times, and we average them. Well, there's no guarantee that averaging does you any good. What if I do 2 or 3 really wrong settings on this? I actually don't want to average those. I want to throw all that out and find the most optimal one. And then again, when you wear it, what is the optimal way you wore it versus what the fixture sees? So when it comes to frequency response analysis and objective analysis of headphones, you have to allow for a certain amount of uncertainty. Nothing about headphone analysis or even equalization should be about precise assessments. When we look at electronics, they're ironclad measurements. There's zero variability. There's no unknown. So when I have my audio precision measure, it's measured. That's it. Speakers, they move a little bit to the left. There's 80 to 90% representative, because there's still techniques in how you measure it and what have you. With headphones, I'd say we're down to 60, 70%. Sometimes the headphone cooperates, and in this case it did actually with HE-6. But some other times they do not, where I can put a headphone on and it just shows such drastic differences in every time I mount it, that you just have to learn, and I'll show you how you learn that technique of being aware of the fact that we're not talking about super accurate assessment in measurements of headphones, okay? So this is a fixture, you put it on, it just has 2 microphone outputs. It goes through a specialized preamplifier from Grass. By the way, nothing's cheap. This is $15,000, so the amplifier is $1,000. And then I run them into my audio precision analyzer, so another $28,000. You can route this into a sound card and capture things, so maybe instead of $28,000, you have a few $100. But I like the simplicity of using my audio precision analyzer. So the measurements you see are using that, although there's nothing special in this case. Acoustic measurements have a lot of room noise, and as just explained, a lot of variations. So we're not after 0.01% precision in anything. These are, again, correlated and roughly accurate measurements, but they have issues in them, okay? So anyway, and that unfortunately creates a barrier. You know, if you don't have this $15,000, you're in trouble. Now, Berlin Care has a $45,000 hat system that simulates the upper body. They say it's designed to be more accurate than this. They were kind enough to loan me one, and I tested it for a while. But I tell you, I could not get anything out of it that I could use because there's no research to show what is the correct frequency response for that. So for a change, spending more gets you less with that. So be very careful when somebody shows you frequency response measurements and they don't tell you that it's not this model and there's no research to back it. Now, relatively speaking, if you have always tested all the headphones using the same gear, sometimes, for many cases, especially if you have good eye, you can analyze and get useful results. There are some hobbyists that do an excellent job there. But in general, to do it right, in my opinion, there's only this solution. Going higher end causes problems for you. Going lower end gets you a lot of grief having to explain why your fixture matches what the research says. So a lot of talking, but so let me go into a review and show you in practice what that means. So I took this Hifiman HE-6, and it says different paths. Turn out the paths to be actually, the old ones wore out, but it's really the stock ones. And I put that on, and boy, did this thing fit like a glove on my measurement rig. I've never seen anything fit this well. The cups are very big, so when you put it around, it really seals nicely, and it's not pushing or changing the artificial ear. And not only did it match well as far as variation, but each channel matched perfectly. And you can see this. I'm doing a stereo sweep in here, which is, by the way, an advantage of my grass measurement rig is that it has two microphones in it. That's another reason it makes it expensive. But it enables me to get two instances of measurements out of one headphone rather than just measuring one and then not knowing what the other one does. There's a 43CA version of it that is just a cup, cup where you can only measure one side of the headphone. You have to clamp it somehow. And that, in my opinion, is not as good as this because you only get one side of it and you're artificially mounting it. It doesn't just mount just like a headphone does. So anyway, the Harman research shows that this dashed line is more or less what we want to see. Why is it looking like this? First, ignore the left side. It peaks up like this because our ears and ear canal and this whole shape is designed to amplify these midtones. The 2 to 5 kilohertz we're especially sensitive to, and we have the best dynamic range and lowest noise level because our ears are basically magnifying that for evolutionary reasons. Our hearing and everything is optimized around that frequency. And below that, you lose that gain and things flatten out. And above that, we start to lose just general hearing anyway. Now, Harman initially went with a curve that was flat from here on all the way down to 20 hertz, but they realized that people liked more bass out of headphones. And indeed, when you're listening to speakers, you're feeling the bass also physically, and there's room gains and other things that, and also a general preference for bass. We like to hear bass. And so they experimented, gave people knobs to adjust more or less bass and treble, and they updated their preference curve to have this much bass in it. Now, if you read the forums and everything, immediately people came out and said, oh, that makes, Harman response means is boomy and bassy. It is not. Most of the emphasis is all the way down to 20, 30, 40 hertz. And that's a region, actually, most of you have not heard what's in your music. I test hundreds of dozens of speakers that don't even play the content that's this low. And with headphones, when you apply this boost in here, you hear this sub-bass region that is just incredibly pleasurable to hear. You're hearing deep, deep notes that to have speakers that go this low, you need incredible freestanding speakers that can be flat response basically to 20 hertz. Maybe a subwoofer can get there and then you've done all the optimization, but I'm telling you, you have not heard proper sub-bass till you hear it on a headphone that's low distortion and is able to go this deep. So I'm completely a believer in this boost. And I've always compensated for it if a headphone just like this doesn't give you that. And I've never found it to create boominess. And I'll show you later on how I apply it. But remember that this bass region can be highly variable because depending on how much air leakage there is around the headphone, this curve can actually tip all the way down here in a measurement. In reality, you may get higher amount of bass, but measurements often show 10, 15, 20 dB deficiency in there. So you got to look at this as an approximate thing, number one, and number two, it's a preference thing. But I'm telling you, when I give you an equalization, I'm picking something that I think will suit just about everybody. Rarely do I hear somebody applying my equalization and come back and say, whoa, it goes all boomy. It is not designed to get boominess. Boominess will come from this 60 to 100 hertz. If you boosted the heck out of this region, then you get boominess, but not in the deep bass. So anyway, this headphone seems like some great effort was put in there to get it to have a flat response in here. They were targeting the pre-Harman discovery that we want more bass, and for that, they deserve some credit. There's certainly design gone into it. So we see that we get to here around 200 hertz, and then the curve just hugs our preference in here. Yes, it's 1 or 2 dB higher, but remember what I said. This preference curve is very approximate. Do not go crazy thinking you need to correct for this 2 dB thing. For all we know, a different mounting or different version of this headphone or this preference curve could be wrong by 2 dB. Also, keep in mind that there's no standards for tonality in music. Whoever makes your music may have too much in here or too little in here. So ultimately, we have a compass in here, not a GPS. We know which one the true north is, which is roughly this kind of shape, but not down to 1 or 2 dB in here. But as we go past 1.2 or 3 kilohertz, we see that from 1.2 all the way up to 3 kilohertz, we are deficient in this area. We're actually lower than our preference curve. The curve, the way it follows up is actually similar to this, but we do have deficiency in here. And I'll talk about this when it comes to equalization. Once we get to 3 or 4 kilohertz, we see that it overshoots. It has probably some kind of resonance in there that's stronger than we want it to be. So here we have some extra energy, but the two channels don't match. So watch out. There's some, we don't necessarily want to take one or the other, and even the average may be wrong. But so level of uncertainty is starting to increase in here. As we go to the right, we see now we have the opposite problem again. We have some deficiency in here. We have a hole. So we probably, and I say emphasize probably, that we have some shortfall in energy there and some treble here may be missing. Post that, things get crazy. If I show you other headphones, every one of them will go nuts like this. Do not trust these measurements. This is a lie. You get deep notches like this because the sound from a headphone hits the side of your head or your ear, changes phase, and comes back and combines with the oncoming direct sound, and it actually cancels out. And because it cancels out because of reflection in your ear, you cannot equalize, you cannot fix this because it's just facts of life that the physics of reflections in your ear is going to do this. So ignore any troughs or, variability in here. Some headphones will be really messy in here. In general, everything about 8 or 9 kilohertz is unreliable anyway, because the science there is quite weak of how do we come up with a calibration curve for that. In this case, so the way to interpret this area is that I look at these peaks and I sort of eyeball an envelope. If I were to just completely get rid of all the ups and downs, what would the line look like? And to me, it looks like it would go higher than our preference line. It would somewhat be like this. And indeed, this preference line is a lie because when Harman measured their speaker, no way a speaker in the room would have a smooth response like this. It would also have reflections that would go up and down. They have filtered the heck out of that graph to give us a simplistic line. Okay? So with respect to this thing, low frequency could be wrong. Mid frequencies tend to be quite good. So between 200 hertz and 2 or 3 kilohertz, my jig basically gives you correct data within the standard deviation. Above that, boy, better be very cautious. You better learn what you're doing in how you interpret this stuff. That's why these reviews have a lot more text in them than my speaker reviews or electronic reviews, because there is a process we have to go through to verify that what we've done here is correct. Okay? Now, the concept of getting used to flat not being right is hard for some people to understand. They just like to see a flat line meaning perfect and everything else is imperfect. But here I'm trying to teach you, saying the perfect is the blue solid dash, the blue dash line. And mentally, some people have trouble with that. So I'll show you a different representation, but I really want to encourage you to learn to like this presentation. And once you do, you'll see that it works better for you. But if we subtract these two curves from each other, what we get is the difference, or deviation or the error. So I'll call that the relative frequency response or deviation. And it basically shows you what we already know. In base frequencies, we have a deficit of 5 dB. Then we go up at 200 hertz, we're at 0 dB now. So everything's good, everything's good. Then here, remember I said we had a deficiency. We get our first deficiency. Then we get a little bit of too much. Then we get deficiency. Then we get craziness. And you better watch out what you're doing with this craziness again, okay? But I want to encourage you to do this. The eye, I think, as you learn, will interpret this a lot easier. And at all times, you know the shape and how the relative relationship is, and you'll get used to using this one more. Okay? Now, tonality is the #1 priority for both headphones and speakers. No question about it. Beyond that, though, it's very easy for me to get a speaker or a headphone to distort. I mean, headphone or speakers turn it up, and the bass usually at some point the speaker blows his brains out and doesn't want to reproduce them, gets heavily distorted. The research out there is basically non-existent. 1 or 2 attempts have been made to characterize distortion with preference, and the results were not conclusive. In my opinion, the testing was done incorrectly, in that if you take 2 headphones with 2 different types of frequency response and 2 types of distortion, frequency response dominates. So of course, if the other one has a higher distortion or lower distortion, doesn't help it much. But to the extent frequency response is what you want, then the lower distortion wins. And the lower distortion especially wins if we're going to boost things up. When we boost things up, we also boost distortion. And in bass frequencies, at least, does not linearly scale. So if you double the amount of bass, you may get 4 times the amount of distortion. So it's important to measure for distortion, but also measure it and present it correctly. Here we see a presentation that I use, but let me show you the presentation other people use. They usually show you a response graph, which is basically the measurement at 94 dB that I use. And by the way, everybody uses different numbers. So I use 94 because that's what was used in the research, I believe, and also what my fixtures calibrated for. So I know that's the most accurate measurement. And then you see the total harmonic distortion in red and the first and second harmonic orders in here. And some people go show you high order ones, and they get 5,000 graphs in here. I find that memorizing this graph and knowing what looks good and what looks bad is very hard. I help it by drawing an arbitrary 40 dB line in here, and I say anything above that is no good. Where did I get 40 dB? Out of my hat. So it's just a reference to have. It doesn't matter what it looks like with the first review, but as I have tested more and more speakers using the exact same standard, we can see which one's worse, which one's better. But I really want to encourage you to learn to look at this one, which is the relative frequency response. And this is basically THT percentage, which is what we use in electronics, which is what is the distortion? Basically saying, what is this a ratio of? Just because this goes up doesn't mean that the distortion's gone up, because the amplitude that has also gone up on this thing. So, and I run this test at 3 levels, 94, 104, and 114 dB SVL. People hear these numbers and they say, wow, that's insane. Like, isn't 114 dB, you know, jet taking off and you're going to go deaf and everything? Well, 114 is quite loud, but they also then go back. So I never listen to 94. I'm telling you, I've listened to this sweep at 94. Yeah, it's a little loud, but it's definitely doable. It's not like what you think it is, because our sensitivity when we listen to music is quite poor in low frequencies. And that's where a lot of the dB is wasted on. 94 dB is like 25 dB above threshold of hearing at 20 hertz. You're only 25 dB higher than baseline. So don't be scared of these numbers. You don't want to be testing at much lower levels than these. So 94 dB is the baseline one in blue. Then I go 10 dB higher, and you notice that the distortion hardly changes in here in red. Basically, this headphone's like, yeah, I can produce 94 and 104, no problem. When I switch to 114 dB, so I'm skipping 10 dB at a time, all of a sudden it gets unhappy in here. And we see basically there's something in the middle here is getting unhappy. Normally headphones go nuts in bass frequencies. This headphone is like cruising in bass frequencies. Even at 114 dB decibels, which is very loud, it only has this 1% distortion at 20 hertz. It's incredibly good. Let me switch you to another headphone that is 3 times this price, 2 times this price. This Abyss Dyna V2 headphone. Look at its THD percentage. First, focus on the bass. They're like astronomical. Even at 94 dB, it's already up to 3%. But more important, that this area, our hearing threshold is pretty high for distortion. But look at where our ears are most sensitive, which is 3 to 5 kilohertz. And look at the distortions. They're off the chart. In a $3,000, $4,000, let me look up how much it was, $3,000 headphone can't produce a low distortion sound. I mean, give me a break. It's just really, really, really bad. So, and a lot of headphones have these kind of sloping up, distortion and bass. Now, this is good for us because, as I explained, we want to boost the bass. So if we take our 94 dB and add 10 dB to it, we only get up to here. So we're still extremely low distortion with this Hifiman HE-6. I run this test called the group delay. A lot of people ask me to run timing tests and give me phase information. I'll do a video to show you that all of that is misguided. But there is something in this group delay, and I won't explain what it means, but essentially, ideal headphone would have this sloping down like this, and then it goes flatline forever. Whenever there's something different, usually means there's some kind of acoustic event happening inside there. So instead of one source of sound, there are multiple sources of sound. One way you get multiple sources of sound is with reflections, right? Remember I said sound comes in, hits your ear, and goes back. And whenever that happens in high frequencies, you get this sharp cancellation. And that is the telltale sign that you do not want to equalize that area of the frequency response, because equalization is in front of the headphone. If you lower the level, both the direct sound and indirect sound change by the same level, so the cancellation remains the same. You can always tell this in the frequency response anyway, that you shouldn't touch this because they'll have those sharp troughs in here, but I mark them in here. Now in here in the middle, we see a bunch of disturbances. It visually looks horrible, but I don't want you to go by that. Just know that there's something technically not correct. If you were the designer of this headphone, you would want to investigate what's happening in here, whether resonances or what is causing that, we don't know. But we see the sign of it over here. Look at the distortion climbing in the same region that it does here. But again, thankfully at lower levels, it's just very much under control. So the only thing you want to get out of here is that don't EQ these sharp corresponding, at 10 kilohertz, don't go EQ anything on 10 kilohertz or this one, wherever that is. And be careful. And some of these peaks also, you don't want to go and try to equalize. But otherwise, this part of the graph looks pretty good. Efficiency of the speakers is quite important. If you just have a phone and you want to drive a headphone with it, you want to have a very efficient headphone. You don't want to use one that needs gobs of power. And so what I do is I take my 94 dB measurement, and then I measure electrically what voltage do I need coming out of a headphone amp to generate 94 dB, which again, remember, 94 dB is not ear piercing. It's good, competent, maybe a little loud, but it's a good volume. You should be able to produce that. And here you see this NAD HB50 only requires 55 millivolts. But this one I just measured, the HE-6, requires 1.2 volts, so 1.3 volts. So by far is the least efficient headphone I've measured, and it has that reputation that it needs extremely powerful amplifiers. In the old days, that was not available, and people would go get home power amps or speakers and then try to drive this with it. And the problem with those amplifiers is that they may have too much noise in them. Today, I had no trouble driving this HE-6 with either my Topping A90 or my RME ADI2 DAC. Both of them drove it to loud enough where I was not comfortable on this thing. So the other thing is that impedance. When I test headphone amplifiers, I test them with 32 ohm load and 300 ohm load, because with a 300 ohm load, how much voltage an amplifier produces determines how much power you get. But when you go the other extreme at 32 ohm, current determines the amount of power you get. So I test both extremes. So when I'm testing headphones, I want to give you an idea of which set of measurements you want to go look at. This headphone's 50 ohms. Sometimes I test at 50 ohm with my headphone amps, but when I don't, you want to more or less pay attention to the 32 ohm measurements because it's going to be current sensitive. The other thing is that the impedance is 100% flat. What that means is that if you have a high impedance headphone amplifier, like a tube one, and if this is variable, it can change the frequency response of the headphone amp can change the frequency response of the headphone by a little bit. But when it's flat, it basically makes it less loud and you get more losses in the headphone amp. So it's not a problem. So this headphone doesn't care if you use a tube headphone to drive, amp to drive it. But I can tell you it's so inefficient that the tube amp would crumble and die on the load that it needs, the amount of current this thing needs. Tube amps tend to be okay for high impedance headphones, but for low impedance, they're just deadly. So we get to listening tests. A lot of people say that I don't listen, I just look at the graphs. I don't know what the heck, where they get that information, because if you look at my reviews, I'd say 70-80% of them have listening tests. When it comes to both speakers and headphones, I absolutely listen. I listen, and I'll do a longer video on this, but I listen to say, hey, are the measurements accurate or not? I also listen to see generally, do I enjoy this or not? When I put these on, I said, wow, sounds good. And by the way, I listened to them before I did all these measurements. I was testing a headphone amp and I put it on and I listened. I remember, for some reason I thought it wouldn't sound good. I put it on, I was like, whoa, this sounds good. And I came over here, this time I did have the measurements and I put it on. I was like, this sounds good, but ever so slightly bright. It was like a little pitchy. I mean, you could tolerate it, but I'm sensitive. I don't want too much highs in there because I think it just gets to me after a while. So I went in there and I put in 4 filters. I always try to minimize the number of filters I put in there, and I always go after the big fish. All of the filters that I design are done by eye. What does that mean? I go look at this curve, and I say, okay, that says we're down 3 dB. We're in this peak is 3 dB higher than it should be. And what's the shape? Okay, it looks like it goes from 2K to 7K. Let me go ahead and create a filter that does more or less what that does. You could mechanically generate a much more accurate one. But remember, the measurements and the target curve are not very accurate. So getting this number like this one, instead of being 5 dB, being 5.5 dB, and this being 1.65 dB, is fantasy. There's no such accuracy in the measurement data. Just because you can go compute accurate data doesn't mean that you land with the better measurements. So anyway, I put these filters in one at a time, and then I experiment and focus only in that energy. Like when I put this bass boost in here for sub bass, I turn it on and first listen to my average tracks to make sure nothing's out of booming. Then I go play the ones with deep sub bass frequencies, 20, 30, 40 hertz in there, and I listen to them. Did they get distorted? Are they still lost and I can't hear them? And I adjust this. Now to taste, you may want to go higher than this, but you can see I only pick like 60 hertz to start, so only 5 dBs I dialed in. I forget what our shortfall was, but I just put 5 in there. It worked. I was done. That's the other thing. I don't kill myself, whether it's my own system or I'm reviewing somebody else's product. I get close enough, I'm done. I'm not spending a lifetime tuning something like this. I want to enjoy music, go on about my life. So then we had the shortfall in here. I put that in there, turn it on, turn it off, turn it on, turn it off. Go through the exact same reference tracks that I listen to every time. Is the effect positive? Is it pleasant? Is it not pleasant? Is it not pleasant? And by the way, sometimes close my eyes and I randomize this stuff. Then I listen with my eyes closed, so I can't even tell which one I'm testing, whether it's equalized or not. If the outcome is not always positive, then I don't go with that EQ, and so on. So you can see this final one in here, for example, was for the brightness. I put one in there that just brings all the levels down. Maybe it needed to be like this rather than flat, but hey, this one worked. And then I do a full on-off testing where in my room player where I put this EQ, I can just turn everything on and off and able to tell whether the effect is overall positive for all the filters put in there. In this case, I had my son with me, and he listened, and I had him test it, and he also agreed that with EQ, all this sounded better than not. So this is a key part of headphone reviews. You cannot just look at my measurements. If you do just that, you're making a mistake. Because again, these are approximate measurements and an approximate target. How do we verify how much of this graph is real? Depends highly on listening tests. And the nice thing is that many of you have access to equalization. We have a kind member that converts my parameters to parameters for a bunch of other equalizers. Go ahead and dial them in. A lot of people have the same headphones, and I'd say 8 or 9 out of 10 times people come back and say, yeah, put in your EQ, wow, it sounded better, or marginally sounded better. Occasionally somebody says, well, you know, well, maybe it was a little too much bass, so I pulled it down. So far the track record across 30, 40 headphones I've tested has been quite good, that this two-step system of measuring and then correcting based on measurements and then optimization of the correction using ears is working, okay? You have to get, I've said this 10 times, you have to get used to uncertainty in here. Nothing about these headphone reviews are absolute, but I want them to be far more reliable than some subjective guy who just puts these headphones on and raves about all kinds of fancy things that you have no idea if it's right or not. Or somebody just gives you measurements and says, go run with it, and here's some EQ that mechanically generated. I'm like, great, you know, what does that mean? So you're getting a hybrid in here of listening tests and measurements. No, they're not double-blind listening tests and what have you. But again, practically, we go, you know, share this data and see where they go. Now, there's one effect in here that is very important with headphones that I don't usually put this allowance for speakers as much, at least. Is this what I call spatial quality? And it's hard to, I can tell you a little bit about how to quantify it, but some headphones, you put them on and the sound is just very close to your head and the instruments are sort of, you know, together. A few of them, and this is one of them, and Sennheiser HE-800S is the other one, do this magical thing where every instrument appears to be slightly separated than the other one. It's a very cool effect. I don't know if it's true fidelity, probably isn't. You never hear that with speaker or in live music. Your head isn't inside the orchestra and the orchestra being miniature around your head. But you hear this very pleasing layering of this stuff. And no, it's never a wide sound stage. It never goes in front of me. I don't know where these people imagining all this in headphone reviews. I've tested like 40 headphones and I've yet to hear what they're described, whether it's a sound stage wide or very deep. They're always around my head and a little bit to the back. But this layering is very special. I had not heard another headphone come close to Sennheiser 800S. And the 800S has large cups and it's got them angled. So I think that creates some kind of timing cues, some spatial characteristics that's pleasing. I can usually improve this aspect in just about every headphone. How do I improve it? I look for shortfall in this region. I guarantee you, if you have a shortfall between 1 and 3.5 kilohertz, 3 to 4 kilohertz, if I boost that, the sound opens up, the soundstage opens up. Because in that region is where you have a lot of channel separation in music. And when you have a recessed area in that region, soundstage collapses on its own because you have less differential information for each ear. That's at least contributes to it. I have done tons of EQ in this region, and I can guarantee you that result. For that reason, it's painful when I have to bring it down, because I know I can get the tonality right, but when I do that, I lose some soundstage. I hate those headphones because now you have a trade-off, and which one's right is up to your preference. Most of the time, though, it's like this, where I'm able to actually improve what's characteristics of a headphone I can actually hype it up and get the tonality to be more correct at the same time. So it's a nice win-win situation. Sorry guys, my nose has been itching during the whole video. I keep scratching it. Anyway, on this thing. So please pay attention to listening tests for headphones, even for speakers, and I'll cover that in another video. It's important to listen and see what I do with equalization. There's a reason I do all this stuff. I got to tell you, I was very worried about having to spend the time to listen to these products, both headphones and speakers. And I thought, well, it wouldn't be great to just put out measurements. I wish I could get away with just putting out measurements, but I just can't. You've got to have a mix of the two to build a story that's credible, that sticks. Specifically, I don't want to tell you, here's the most perfect measuring thing, and then go listen to it myself and say, this doesn't sound good. How would I ever be able to explain that to you? If I run into you in the street and you ask me, it's like, but how does it sound? I was, oh, it sounded terrible. It's like, well, why'd you say it was a great headphone? Well, because the graph was close to the measurement. It's just the science. The science here is incredibly powerful, incredibly useful, but you have to be able to develop an eye for approximation, trends, envelopes, and overall assessment of a product, not just, specifics of it. So anyway, this is a good headphone. Fortunately, it's discontinued, and also secondarily was $1,300 when new. So I'll be, I've tested other headphones that are great, so other choices, and I'll be testing more in Hifiman line also. Okay, sorry this video is long. Hopefully you learned something out of it as far as how to read these frequency response measurements and my workflow in there, so that in the future I don't have to emphasize it as much. Okay, see you in a future video. Bye-bye.